What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making an old abandoned Volkswagen van. It's definitely been a minute since we created something abandoned on this channel, so I thought it'd be a lot of fun to create something old and beaten up for this week's model. I've been wanting to create an old Volkswagen van for some time now, so I thought this week would be a perfect opportunity to create one. So I decided to jump on Google Images and search up random Volkswagen references, and I came across a couple images, so I quickly jumped into Photoshop, chopped those things up, and created my own image planes that we could use as a reference. Now, if you're familiar with this channel, you'll know I don't really use image planes that often. Nothing against image planes, they are extremely helpful and you really should use them whenever you have the chance to. I just don't use them when I recreate models on this YouTube channel because I find it's good practice to play around with proportions, and it's just a lot more fun not being confined to specific measurements or schematics that you have to follow. I just like freely creating these models, and it's just a lot more fun in my opinion. However, because this Volkswagen is modeled off of a specific Volkswagen model, I thought it would just make my life a lot easier using image planes for this week's video so I can roughly block out the correct shape and not really worry about the proportions too much. So I just imported a top, side, and front view of this Volkswagen, and then I started blocking out the main shapes. Now I'm not going to worry about getting everything perfect right off the start, and to be honest I wasn't really sure how I was going to approach this. It's definitely been some time since I modeled a vehicle, so we're just going to play around with things until they start looking correct. Now keep in mind I'm just working on one side of this van just to make my life easier, and once we're happy with how things are looking I can duplicate it over to create the other side. So once I had one side of my van blocked out, I can start moving on to the roof. Very similar to the walls, we're going to start off with a cube, and using these reference image planes, I can roughly block out the roof shape. And I also decided to change a few small things up along the way. For example, those small windows you see in the roof in the reference, I decided not to add those into my model, mostly because I was feeling a little bit lazy. Alright, so next up was just moving on to the front bumper. Now, very similar to all the other shapes, I'm going to start off with a cube and we can start blocking out roughly what the bumper looks like. Once again, I'm not going to worry too much about getting it perfect right now. I just want to roughly get these shapes into position and then we can start refining them and tweaking them afterwards. Oh, also, I just want to give a huge thank you to everyone who has subscribed and helped support my channel. Last week, I finally hit my goal of 10,000 subscribers. I can't even believe we hit this goal, so I just want to give a really big thank you to everyone. And as always, I want to give a huge thank you to all of my Patreons. You guys are all amazing, and I can't thank you enough for your continuous support. Alright, so the front bumper is looking good. Next up is creating that long strip that goes down the side wall on my van. Now, at the time, I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to go about this. Originally, I was thinking I should just create this as its own separate object, which would probably make my life easier, and I can just extrude it along the whole side of my van and follow my reference. Now, looking back, I probably should have done that. It definitely would have made my life easier, but I decided to add it directly into the geometry and into that side wall. So all I'm going to do here is just start moving vertices so I can basically recreate that long strip that's in my reference photo. And for everywhere I can't move those vertices, I'm going to use that multi-cut tool and I can just basically create a long strip. Ideally keeping everything in quads, but we're not going to worry too much right now. I just want to roughly get that shape in position. So next up on the list are the windows and window frames. Now I decided to keep these window frames extremely straightforward. I didn't want to overcomplicate this small piece. So all we're going to do for this one is insert a cube and I can roughly block out the window frame that's in my reference photo. Now once I'm happy with that main shape, I can duplicate it for all my other ones, but that front driver's side window is a little bit different in shape, so we will have to recreate this one from scratch using the exact same process. Now, I thought it would be fun to separate the door from my frame. Not only would it just look cool and I could have one of the doors slightly open, but I thought it would also look a little bit better having those seams directly where those door cutouts are. Now, obviously this is going to make my life a little bit more difficult, and to be honest, I probably could have gotten away with all of these seams directly in the material when we got into Substance Painter. But like always, I find those small details are always nice adding in the geometry if you have the ability to do so. And this van isn't being put into a video game or anything, so we are fine to add all the polys that we want. Now all I'm going to do for this is make sure that my edge loops are lining up with those lines on my door reference, and if they aren't there, I'm just going to start moving some vertices around or adding some where I need to. That way I can have my geometry line up with that door reference, and once everything's looking good, I can select all of those faces and simply extract it from the model. And just like that, we have our little door. Alright, so next up is jumping back to those long strips that go down the side of my van. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this whole shell object over, and since we lined them up with our reference photos, I'm just going to select all of those faces where that line object is, and I can extract it from the model to create its own separate model. Since we separated the door from our shell, we need to make sure that this long strip that goes down the side of my van is basically cut into 3 pieces. One for the door, one for the front, and one for the side. And once everything is aligned correctly to the side of my van, I'm just going to add a small bevel in the middle of this long strip. That way I can easily add that separate material later on in Substance Painter. If you look at the reference photos on Google, here's basically just a metal strip that goes down the whole side, and there's a smaller black line that's directly in the middle. So by adding these edge loops, it's just going to make my life that much easier when I'm applying these materials later on. So I wasn't very happy with the results I was getting, and I noticed when I did some more Googling, it looked like in these old vans, everything above that long strip was extruded outwards a little bit, and that helped give it a little bit more depth. So I thought I would add that into this model to make it look a little bit more realistic. So what I decided to do was basically select all of those faces above that long strip, and I can extrude them outwards a little bit to give it that small bump. And then I just had to take those strips I created previously and just align them up correctly so they were sitting just above it, and that way it looked like it was more accurate to my reference photo. And then I went ahead and just repeated the same process for the other 2 parts of my bus, the side door that we extracted earlier, as well as the very front. Alright, so next up was moving on to that front Volkswagen logo on the front of the bus. Now, to be honest, I had no idea how I was going to approach this, but what I decided to do was insert a cylinder, line that up with my reference, and then remove those front and back faces. All I decided to do was start extruding some edges to roughly put it into the shape of a V and a W, and by the time I was finished, I thought it looked actually somewhat accurate to my reference photo, so I decided to leave it and go with this. So next up was working on those front headlights. Now I thought it would be really cool to be able to see through these front headlights, to see that inner light through the material. So what I'm going to have to do is create some booleans. So I'm going to create a small cylinder, cut out a small hole right where that front headlight is on my reference photo. And then I can add a small bevel to the outside edge to create a nice hole where that headlight's going to sit. Then I can create another small cylinder to start blocking out that actual headlight shape. And then I can add a small sphere, chop it in half to create that glass that's going to sit on the front of my headlight. Now I do want to be able to see through it like I mentioned earlier, so I am going to add a cylinder to sit underneath that headlight. That way we can add a small opacity to that front glass piece, and you can see hopefully through it a little bit to see that inside light shape. And then I'm going to take this whole front headlight that I just created and duplicate it over and shrink it down a bit to create the smaller orange light that sits above it. So like every car out there, it's very important to see the cars behind you. So we need to add a review mirror so our driver can see those vehicles. So what we're going to do is So I just imported a top, side, and front view of this Volkswagen, and then I started blocking out the main shapes. Now I'm not going to worry about getting everything perfect right off the start, and to be honest, I wasn't really sure how I was going to approach this. It's definitely been some time since I modeled a vehicle, so we're just going to play around with things until they start looking correct. So once I had one side of my van blocked out, I can start moving on to the roof. Very similar to the walls, we're going to start off with a cube, and using these reference image planes, I can roughly block out the roof shape. Now keep in mind, I'm just working on one side of this van just to make my life easier, and once we're happy with how things are looking, I can duplicate it over to create the other side. And I also decided to change a few small things up along the way. For example, those small windows you see in the roof in the reference, I decided not to add those into my model. Mostly because I was feeling a little bit lazy. Alright, so next up was just moving on to the front bumper. Now very similar to all the other shapes, I'm going to start off with a cube and we can start blocking out roughly what the bumper looks like. Once again, I'm not going to worry too much about getting it perfect right now. I just want to roughly get these shapes into position, and then we can start refining them and tweaking them afterwards. Low poly wheel that we can use, and then I decided to change it up later on in the video. So all I'm going to do is insert a cylinder, delete those outside faces, and start extruding that inside edge to roughly match my reference photo. Once again, I wasn't too concerned about making this wheel perfect. I just wanted a simple generic wheel so I can fit it into place. So right now we don't have a floor in the van, and I want to avoid being able to see through the model. Now I don't want to obviously model all those components that are directly underneath it because we're not going to see it, but I do want to block it out so it creates some shadow, just so you can't see basically through my floor. Also, we don't want our little human to fall through the floor in our car because that wouldn't be good, so we need to add some sort of floor object. So all I'm going to do here, I'm going to keep this very straightforward, is I'm just going to add a small cube. I can delete all those faces so I only have one side face to work with, and I can just extrude it to go along roughly the shape of my floor. Like I said, I just want to basically create some shadow, so when we do render out this model, we're not seeing directly through underneath the vehicle, and it just creates some more shadows so we don't have to add any objects underneath it. Alright, so right now we have some windowless windows, so we need to add some sort of glass over our frame. So what we're going to do is add a small plane. I can basically decrease those divisions so it's very low in polys, and I can start roughly blocking out the window shape. So I thought it would be cool to add some broken glass into our scene. Since this is technically an abandoned Volkswagen, we don't want it to look too pristine and clean looking. So I thought some broken glass would be very fitting. So what we're going to do is select one of those planes I already created, and I can start removing some of those faces to add some jagged edges so it looks like some broken glass. And we're also going to go back to that roof rack. I'm just going to add a few edge loops onto these metal poles, and I can basically bend them a tiny bit so everything looks not so perfect. So next up is adding some small door handles because we need to be able to open these doors. So we're going to add a small cube, and I can start blocking out roughly a handle shape. Now, like I mentioned earlier in the video, I could have easily added some door seams directly into the material, and you probably wouldn't be able to notice too much of a difference. However, it's always nice to add those details into the geometry if you can, so what we're going to do is select some of those faces right where those seams are, and I can extrude them inwards so we can create that nice little indent. Now we will have to add some small cuts into those long strips we have, just because we added those small door seams. So originally I was planning on leaving my roof rack empty. I actually liked the idea of it just being completely abandoned, but the more I looked at it, the more I felt like something was missing. So what I decided to do was add a surfboard. I decided to change this whole model into more of a surfing van rather than just a generic random van. So the story is that this van once belonged to a group of surfers that lived on the West Coast. Now these people were informed of a really great surfing spot that was only known to the locals. Now since they weren't local, they had to drive around and go through some treacherous dirt roads to try to find this place. So while they were driving down one of these dirt roads, they hit a really gnarly pothole which completely messed up one of the tires. Now this van was already struggling. It was pretty old and beaten and running on its last legs. So once they hit this pothole and the tire just completely got messed up, they just knew this was the end of the van's life. So these surfers just picked up their things, left the van where it was, and decided to walk back into town. Now since we have some broken windows and I wanted to make the glass a little bit see-through, we need to add an interior. Now I don't want to spend too much time on this, it's barely going to be visible in our render, but I do want to add some sort of object on the inside, that way you can just see a little bit of shape when you're looking through that window. So I'm going to add some cubes and we can block out some generic seats. They're going to be very low in polys and very simplified. Like I said, they're barely going to be in view, so I don't want to spend too much time on these. Alright, so we only have a few objects left to make in our scene, and one of those are the window wipers. Now once again, keeping this very straightforward, I don't want this to be too complex, it's going to be so small in our scene, so I'm just going to add a few cylinders and we can roughly block out a window wiper. Now since this Volkswagen is abandoned, it would only be fitting to add some dents. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to select some vertices and start skewing some of them to add some dents into this geometry. Now of course you can add this directly into the material and you don't have to actually deform your geometry, but like I always say, if you have the ability to add it into your geometry, I think you're going to get a bit better results. Now like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I did come back to work on these wheels. I wasn't completely satisfied. I wanted something a bit higher in poly. Now I know a few of you are going to be asking me to create more game ready models, so I thought while we're here I would quickly go over that process and what I would do to create a low and a high poly wheel. So what I'm going to start off with is selecting one of my tires I already created, and I can just remove some of those bevels I already created, and that way I can bring it into a lower poly state. So now that I have my low poly tire ready, I can open up my UV editor, delete history, freeze transformation, center pivot, and I can do a camera-based projection to remove the cuts. And then simply by using my 3D cut and sew UV tool, I can start adding my cuts wherever I want them. So I'm gonna add one right on the top where those two treads are on my tire. That way I can easily add a tread pattern in Substance Painter afterwards if I had to. And then once those cuts are all made, I can highlight those UV shells, Control U to unfold them, and Control L to lay them out. Now that my low poly tire is ready to go and it's all UV'd, I can simply just start selecting some of those edges and adding bevels to them, and then I can even add a smoothing effect to really increase those polys and make those edges nice and smooth. So basically I can use this low poly tire in game, and I can use this higher poly tire as the one I texture in Substance Painter. This is more or less the whole high and low poly model workflow. Obviously this increases your modeling time just because you have to basically create double the amount of models for high and low poly modeling, but this is exactly how I would go about it. Now we're not going to be doing this in this video. I decided to make a more of a higher poly wheel. I wanted to add that tread pattern directly into my geometry. So what I decided to do was delete that low poly wheel, and I can take this higher poly wheel I already have, and then I can start adding some edge loops right where I want that tread pattern to be. Now don't get me wrong, this is not a tire tutorial or anything like that. I'm just adding some simple tread pattern, but there are other really great tutorials out there on YouTube, so if you're more interested in actually making a real lifelike tire, you should go check out those other tutorials. But like I said, I wanted to add that tread pattern into this geometry, so I'm going to select all of those faces I have on this tire, extrude them by keeping those faces not connected together. That way I can individually extrude these faces separate from one another, so it looks like there's some sort of tread pattern happening. Alright, and last but not least, I was taking a look at the model and I thought no one would leave a perfectly good surfboard behind. So it was only fitting to make it look broken. So all I did was highlight the front of the surfboard and simply extract it to separate it from the model. And I can just basically rotate it downwards and reattach the bottom. That way it looked like it was just snapped in half. And then I decided to wrap up the modeling and move on to those textures. Alright, so really quickly before we jump into those textures, I wanted to show you exactly how I did those UVs and how I prepared the model for Substance. Now, of course, if you want to see this whole video, including the whole UV mapping process in real time, I will be uploading this full video to my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. Alright, so what I decided to do is break this thing up into two groups for the two different textures applied. So first off, I did take all the objects on this side and just duplicated them over, and I added another broken window on this side just to add some more variation. And I also decided to break off this one little wood panel on the top, just so it looked a little bit more interesting, at least in my opinion. Now, another thing I did was take this tire that we created earlier, the high poly one, and I just basically duplicated it into the position of the other tires in the scene. And then I took the tire on this side and just decided to deflate it. So I just basically used my soft select brush, selected some of those edges, and I can just move them up a little bit just so it looked a little bit deflated. So for those textures, the very first texture and group is the whole shell shape, basically the whole main van shape. Now, I probably could have fit everything onto one texture, but I thought I could get a little bit more resolution out of those final renders and materials if I just split this thing up. So that's really the only reason why. So the second group and texture is basically everything else in the scene. So I decided to put all the windows and the roof rack along with those little low poly seats or weird looking seats into this group as well. Now I wasn't worried about the interior at all just because you're barely going to see it, but I wanted something there just so I can have some sort of like silhouette looking through those windows because I wanted to make them a little bit transparent, and also there's a hole in some of these windows as well. Anyways, that is how I prepared this model. Now let's jump into Substance Painter and we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in our FBX file from Maya. And really quickly before we bake out those textures, I'm going to go up to the top right corner to our shader settings, and I'm going to change that to alpha blending. So not only am I going to do this so I can add an opacity channel so I can have some transparent windows, but I also am using a lot of one-sided faces in my scene. So in my editor, you can see right through them, and by switching it to alpha blending, it's just going to make them opaque and make them look normal. Once everything is all set up, I can go ahead and bake out those textures. Alright, so to start this thing off, I'm going to go over to my smart materials and I'm going to start filling up these empty meshes with some sort of material. To be honest, I wasn't exactly sure which route I wanted to go to when it came to the textures. I didn't know if I wanted it to be green or a brown bus or an orange bus. There's so many different options, but the first color that jumped out to me when I thought of these old Volkswagens was that turquoise green blue color. Not only is it just one of my favorite colors, but it's just the first color I think of for some reason when I think of these old Volkswagens. So I'm going to start off by using that steel painted clear coat smart material that comes with Substance Painter, and then I can just assign that to that lower part of my van. Now obviously I did make cuts along those seams to make my life a little bit easier here, so I'm just going to use the UV chunk fill, and I can start filling in those chunks with whatever material I would like. Then I'm just going to change this black color, which to be honest I kind of like, but we're going to switch it to this turquoise blue-green color I was talking about. Now I'm not going to worry about getting these colors perfectly dialed in right off the bat. We can always come back to them and tweak them later on. So I'm basically going to repeat this exact same process, but instead of using a turquoise, green, blue, I'm going to just use a simple white, and I can assign it to the other UV chunks that are on the top part of my bus. So I'm going to do the exact same process for a few of the other empty meshes in my scene. So that long strip down the side of my van, I'm going to add a metal material, and then I'm going to fill in that little tiny black strip in the middle of it as well. Same thing with my front headlights. I'm going to fill in those empty meshes with some sort of smart material, along with that small little orange light that sits above it. Now this is abandoned, so we definitely need to add some wear and tear. So I'm going to start out by adding just a base rust material, and then I can add a masking effect over it, as well as a few empty fill layers, and I can add different masking effects to add some dirt and grunge. Now it's important to slowly build these up. Don't go crazy and just use one crazy masking effect. I find you get much better results by just slowly building them up. Alright, so next up were the wheels. Now I could have just used the regular smart material, but I always find for wheels, for some reason, if I can find an image of a side wheel, I can just draw that on and I get better results. So I jumped on Google Images, found just a generic tire, and I brought that in as a texture, and then I'm just going to paste this directly on the side of my wheel, and then I can add another material to it to match the same color. Alright, so next up was moving on to the next texture set. So I wanted to start off with those windows, so I used that glass film smart material, and I made sure I had an opacity channel applied to this texture set, and then I can assign that material to those windows. Now, of course, they're going to be very clear, and this is an abandoned van, so we want to really dirty up these windows by adding different grunge and dirt effects by simply adding fill layers and attaching those effects to them. Now Substance just added a few different base materials into the library from their last update, so I thought it would be fun to explore with them and try to incorporate one of them into this model. So there's this awesome paint cracked material that comes with Substance. So I decided to throw that onto my sidewalls, which gave it a really cool cracked paint-like effect. And then by switching that over to a white mask, I can just manually choose wherever I wanted those cracks to show by simply just erasing all the other areas. So that's what I did. I just only choose a couple of them. I didn't want to make it too extreme, but I did choose to keep a couple in various spots, which I think really helped make this material look beaten and worn out. So I just continued to add different dirt and grunge effects by adding different fill layers. And then I also added a rust material and then manually went in with a brush and started filling in some of those cracks with a rust color. Now I know you can do similar effects by using anchor points or similar tools, but I really like manually going in and just adding those wherever I'd like them. I feel like I have more control. I know it is a bit more time consuming, but I find you get really great results. Alright, so next we're jumping back to those windows. I thought it would be really fun and fitting to add some cracks into those materials. So I jumped on Google and found random alphas of just random various cracks. I found 2 in particular that I found fitting, dragged those into my project as alphas, and then I can simply just paste those directly onto my window. Alright, so next up was the roof rack. So very similar to the other ones, I'm just going to use some smart materials to fill in those empty meshes, and then we can start adding a bit of dirt and grunge over top of them. And same thing for the surfboard. I actually didn't know what I wanted to do for the surfboard. I was thinking originally just using a plain white color, but I thought that would be a bit too boring and I wanted to add a bit more color to the scene. So I decided to go with a simple beige as the base color and then fill in a more of an orange, brighter color for the inside of the surfboard. And then also for the part that's broken, I didn't want it to be the same color, so I thought white would be fitting as some sort of white foam-like material. And then I just called it good on the surfboard. I didn't want to spend too long on it. Alright, so I threw this van into the renderer to take a look at how everything was looking. And to be honest, I was happy with it, but I just wasn't satisfied with the amount of wear and tear. For this thing being considered an abandoned van, I thought it should be much more beaten up and have much more rust. So let's go back into the editor and we can add some more rust, dirt, and grunge. So just like all the other dirt and rust, we are going to add a few extra fill layers, and I can use different masking effects to add more dirt and grunge. I really wanted to make this thing a lot more dirty and beaten up. And it definitely did help. It was looking much more beaten up and a much more abandoned looking, but there were a few extra details I thought I should add. One of them were those front orange lights. They were looking too smooth and plain, and if you looked at reference from real Volkswagen vans, they had tiny little bumps like little rivets in them. So I decided to add a fill layer, turn off all those channels to only have a height channel. I would go over to my textures and find a nice stripe pattern effect and add it to that height channel. That way I can add a very subtle bump effect to this light, and hopefully it would look a little bit more realistic. I also wanted to add a bit more obvious rust. So similar to how we did it before, I'm just going to use that base rust material that comes with Substance, and I can manually go in and start brushing on that effect wherever I want them, specifically around the edges and creases, just so it looks like more rust is building up in those areas. I also thought it would be fun to add a few surfing stickers. Since this is a surfing van, I thought a few extra stickers on the back would be fitting for this piece. So I jumped on Google and found old random surfing stickers I found fitting, dragged those into my project as a texture, and then I can simply just paste these textures directly onto my mesh. And of course, once those stickers are applied to my van, I want to go in with my eraser tool and start removing some of the stickers to make it look worn out. So once again, I was looking at the van in the renderer and I still thought we should add a bit more rust. So I was experimenting with a few different things and a few different new materials that came with Substance Painter, and I saw one in particular that had this peeling effect that I thought was really cool. Now I don't do this a lot in my videos, but I thought it'd be fun to use parts of this material onto my existing material on my van. So similar to how we did the other one, I'm basically going to apply this material to all of my paint. I can turn that into a white mask and then start erasing all the other areas I don't want those rust pieces. Now since these rust pieces are quite large, I only need to pick a few of them that I think are fitting, and I can erase all the other ones in my model. And I really think that this added a lot of value to the model. It really made it look more beaten up and worn out, and I think it was a little bit closer to what I had in mind when I thought of this whole abandoned van idea. Now this was actually fairly easy. All I had to do was basically adjust that blue color that was on this paint to match my other paint that was already on my van. And I just had to erase as close as I can to those rust pieces, and they would basically blend in together and you wouldn't really be able to see a difference. And to be honest, I was actually quite surprised with how it turned out. It turned out a lot better than I originally planned. I was more experimenting and I just decided to keep it. But I'm pretty happy with how this whole abandoned van actually came out in the end. Alright, that is basically everything. That is the whole 3D modeling and texturing process that I did to create this old abandoned Volkswagen van. Thank you all for tuning into this week's video. If you liked it, smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe to see more weekly 3D content. And don't forget, if you want to see this full video in a real-time pace, along with the whole UV mapping process, all of that will be uploaded to my Patreon page along with all the working files. So if you want to see any of that, you can find it in the link in the description below. As always, a huge thank you to all of my Patreons for your continuous support. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will catch you all in the next one.